There's something unsettling about the wilderness at night. Maybe it's the pitch-black darkness, or the sound of wind rustling through the leaves, carrying with it an eerie, disembodied whisper. Or perhaps it's the sense of isolation, the awareness that you're miles away from any human presence, surrounded only by the unknown. That's exactly what drew Jake to hiking. He thrived on that loneliness, on the feeling of disconnecting from the world. But this time, he would find that the wilderness had its own dark secrets, secrets that should have stayed buried. Jake, an experienced hiker, had heard rumors about a remote trail deep within the Pinewood Forest. The locals whispered about it with dread, calling it the Trail of Shadows. They claimed that people who ventured there sometimes didn't come back. Those who did return changed, haunted by nightmares and strange hallucinations. Dismissing it as mere folklore, Jake decided to explore it for himself, believing he could handle whatever the trail threw at him. He set off early in the morning, equipped with a sturdy backpack filled with food, water, and camping gear. The sun cast long shadows through the trees as he hiked deeper into the forest. The trail, at first well-trodden and clear, began to narrow, the vegetation thickening around him. Hours passed, and soon, there was no trail at all, just an expanse of trees that seemed to grow denser with every step. That's when he noticed a strange hush that fell over the forest. There were no birds, no insects. Only the sound of his own footsteps crunching against the underbrush. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Jake shook off the unease. He was here to challenge himself, to conquer the unknown. Yet, as he continued walking, he felt something odd. No matter how long he trekked, it felt like he was moving in circles. Landmarks he thought he'd left behind reappeared before him, a distinctive moss-covered boulder, a tree with a split trunk. Worried he might be lost, he pulled out his compass. The needle spun aimlessly, refusing to settle. Cursing under his breath, he pulled out his map. But the map made no sense either. The lines and symbols seemed to blur and shift before his eyes. An unsettling thought crept into his mind: the forest itself was changing. As the sun began to set, Jake decided to set up camp. He found a small clearing, pitched his tent, and started a fire. The flickering flames cast long, dancing shadows around him. Jake ate his meal in silence, all the while feeling the oppressive darkness of the woods pressing in on him. Just as he was about to retire to his tent, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. Jake froze. The figure was tall and thin, its face obscured by the shadows. For a moment, it didn't move, just stared at him from the darkness. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice wavering slightly. No response. The figure stepped back, disappearing behind a tree. Heart pounding, Jake grabbed his flashlight and shone it in the direction of the figure. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was no one there. Only trees, swaying gently in the breeze. Must have been a trick of the light, he muttered, trying to calm himself. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay in his tent, staring up at the nylon ceiling, listening intently. Around midnight, he heard its soft, deliberate footsteps circling his campsite. He held his breath, too afraid to move. The footsteps stopped right outside his tent, followed by a long, heavy silence. Then, a voice low and raspy whispered his name. "Jake." Jake bolted upright, his heart hammering in his chest. He unzipped the tent and shone his flashlight around. The clearing was empty. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Morning couldn't come soon enough. Jake hastily packed up and decided to head back. But as he tried to retrace his steps, he found himself even more disoriented. Every path he took led him back to the clearing. Panic set in. He yelled for help, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the trees. It was then that he saw it again, the figure from the previous night. This time, it was closer, standing in the middle of the path. Jake's skin prickled with fear. He squinted, trying to make out its features. "Who are you?" he demanded, but his voice was trembling. The figure stepped forward, into the light. Jake gasped. It was a man, or what used to be one. His face was gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow and sunken. He wore tattered hiking gear, and his skin was covered in dirt and scratches. There was something terribly wrong with him, something unnatural. "I got lost," the man croaked. "Been here for so long." Jake felt a surge of pity mixed with fear. "How long have you been out here?" The man's lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "Forever." Before Jake could react, the man lunged at him. Jake stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. He turned and ran, his pulse thundering in his ears. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to get away. Branches clawed at his face and arms as he tore through the forest. He ran until his legs burned, until his lungs felt like they were going to explode. Finally, he stumbled into another clearing and collapsed, gasping for breath. But something was wrong. He looked around, his heart sinking. It was the same clearing. The same trees. The same broken branches he'd stepped on before. He was back where he'd started. And standing at the edge of the clearing was the man. Only now, there were others with him. Figures emerging from the shadows, men and women in various states of decay, all with the same hollow, haunted eyes. "Join us," they whispered in unison. "Stay with us, forever." Jake screamed and ran again. But no matter where he went, they were always there, appearing just beyond the edge of his vision, whispering his name, beckoning him to join them. Days blurred into nights. Jake lost track of time. His supplies dwindled. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and thirst made his throat feel like sandpaper. Exhaustion weighed down but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let them catch him. One night, he collapsed against a tree, too weak to move. He could hear them approaching, their footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. Tears streamed down his face as he realized he couldn't run anymore. "Please," he whispered. "Just let me go." A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see the first man, the one who'd claimed to be lost. The man knelt down beside him, his eyes filled with something that looked almost like pity. "No one ever leaves," the man murmured. "You belong to the forest now." Jake's vision blurred. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the man's skeletal hand reaching out to touch his forehead. Weeks later, a search party found Jake's campsite. His tent was still there, undisturbed. His backpack lay on the ground, its contents untouched. But there was no sign of Jake. The forest was silent as the searchers called his name. Somewhere deep within the woods, hidden among the shadows, a figure watched them with hollow eyes. A new hiker had joined the trail of shadows. And he, too, was lost forever.